I'm Mr. Loomis. Welcome back for our final lesson about World War I. Actually, most of this lesson is about what came after the war finished, which is the really interesting part of this story. We'll start by reviewing today's topics. We'll begin by learning about the role American soldiers played in the war and how the war finally ended, which we call the armistice. We'll spend quite a bit of time talking about Wilson's 14 points, his ideas for what the world should be like after the war, and the Treaty of Versailles that was negotiated by Wilson and the other world leaders. Then we'll spend some time talking about a great debate that happened in the Senate over ratification, or the vote to approve the treaty. Finally, we'll end by learning about isolationism and how that led to changes in immigration, a Red Scare, and the famous trial of 2 Italian immigrants. Let's pick up the story of the war with the arrival of the United States. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, both the Allies and the Central Powers had been fighting already for years. Great Britain and France had borrowed a lot of money to buy supplies made in the United States, and Germany was having a hard time finding supplies because of the British blockade. While the 200,000 American troops that went to France was a small fraction of the total Allied armies, the addition of new soldiers and the promise of many more who would come over the coming years was enough to make a difference in the war. By March 1918, the Germans had won the war in the east against Russia. A revolution in Russia started the year before, and the people of Russia had risen up and gotten rid of Tsar Nicholas II. Communist revolutionaries, led by Vladimir Lenin, won the revolution and started working to turn Russia into a communist country. They wanted to work on making the Soviet Union, not fighting Germany. So Russia agreed to a peace treaty with Germany. Germany moved the soldiers that had been fighting Russia to the other side of Europe to fight the French, British, and Americans. The American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, under General John Blackjack Pershing, joined the fight in May 1918, just in time to meet the Germans coming from the east. In battles between May and August of 1918, the American, British, and French armies were able to stop the German attacks. The fighting was terrible, and over 10,000 Americans were killed or hurt in just 3 weeks. In one battle, 1,087 men died in just one day. But as bad as they were, the Americans lost only a tiny number of men compared to France and Great Britain. Still, these summer battles were enough to change the war. While the Germans, with the Germans being pushed out of France and Belgium by the end of July 1918. By the end of September 1918, over 1 million American soldiers made a full attack into the Argonne Forest. By November, after almost 40 days of fighting, the German lines were broken, and their army leaders told Kaiser Wilhelm II that Germany needed to find a way to end the war. Wilhelm abdicated, or quit as king, and left Germany. 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, Germany and the Allies agreed to an armistice, or truce, and said that they would begin working on a peace treaty. November 11th, or Armistice Day, is still a holiday around the world. In the United States, November 11th is called Veterans Day. When the armistice was announced, 117,000 American soldiers had been killed and 206,000 wounded. Allies had lost over 5.7 million soldiers, mostly Russian, British, and French men. Central Powers lost 4 million men. Although the Americans joined at the very end of the war, and Americans were less than half of 1% of all the men who died, the arrival of the Americans was enough to make the difference and help the Allies win. The war had a huge effect on the United States, but made an even bigger difference in Europe. Of the 60 million European men who had joined the armies from 1914 to 1918, 8 million were killed. 22 million had been hurt. Germany lost 15.1% of its young men. Austria-Hungary lost 17.1%, and France lost 10.5%. Hundreds of thousands of civilians also died, mostly because there was not enough food and people who were not strong enough to fight off sickness. 1914, typhus killed 200,000 in Serbia. From 1918 to 1922, 3 million people died from typhus. Nothing, however, compared to the flu pandemic that spread around the world during the war. Overall, the 1918 flu pandemic killed at least 50 million people, or between about 3 and 5% of all the people in the world. While Wilson had tried to keep the United States out of the war, he thought that since America had been a part of the war at the end, America should be part of making the plan for what the world would look like after the war. Since there had been no fighting in the United States and fewer Americans had died than from other countries, the United States was the world's strongest country in 1918. Wilson wanted to use this power to get other countries to agree to follow his ideas about moral diplomacy. Actually, in January 1918, before Americans had even joined the fight, Wilson gave a speech to describe his ideas for what should come after the war. He had 14 ideas, and his plan and speech are now called the 14 Points. Wilson said that countries should not keep secrets, that there should be free trade, freedom of the seas, people should vote for their leaders, and more. Also, he wanted to make a League of Nations as a sort of club for countries to talk about their problems instead of fighting. As the war ended, Wilson said that he would go to the Paris Peace Conference himself instead of sending someone else to represent the United States. This was very unusual. Because Wilson was going, other countries' leaders also went to the conference. And the Paris Peace Conference was the largest meeting of world leaders ever at that time. For 6 months, Wilson stayed in Paris to work on the treaty. The people of France were excited for Wilson to come, but other world leaders were not sure Wilson's plans for peace without victory were a good idea. Great Britain, France, and Italy wanted revenge on Germany for getting them into the war. They wanted to be stronger so they could protect themselves and to keep their colonies. Great Britain and France wanted Germany to have to pay and give up land. Japan hadn't joined the fight in Europe, but they wanted new land in Asia. And Italy wanted more land in Europe. Finally, many countries were worried about Vladimir Lenin and the communists who had taken over in Russia. Mostly, they were worried that communist revolutions might start in other countries. So Wilson came to Paris looking for ways to prevent a future war, but the other countries' leaders had very different goals. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles, that officially ended World War I, didn't include much from Wilson's 14 points. The Japanese, French, and British got land and colonies from Germany. France and Great Britain got new colonies in the Middle East, like Iraq and Palestine. France made sure the treaty had a war guilt clause that said that Germany had started the war and had to pay $33 billion to the Allies as a penalty. The only idea from the 14 points that Wilson was able to get into the final treaty was his dream for a League of Nations. And the key, Wilson hoped, to stopping future wars was that all member countries of the League said they would defend any country that was attacked. This was Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. And Wilson thought no country would dare to start a war knowing that the whole rest of the world would fight back. But in the end, it was this Article 10 that stopped Wilson's dream from coming true. The other countries in Paris agreed to the Treaty of Versailles, but for Wilson, his hardest job was after he came home to America. The Constitution gives presidents the power to make treaties with other countries, but the Senate must ratify or approve any treaty before the United States has to follow it. This is an important limit on the power of the president. Wilson knew that the most important thing for the senators was Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. Even before Wilson came home, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge said that he did not think the treaty or the League of Nations were good ideas. Lodge was an isolationist. He did not want the United States to get involved in agreements with other countries. Lodge was afraid that Article 10 would take away Congress's power to decide when the United States would and would not go to war. If the United States joined the League of Nations, the country would have to defend any other country that was attacked, no matter what. For Lodge and other Republicans in the Senate, this was not okay. They thought the United States should stay totally independent of the world and its problems. On the other side, interventionists like Wilson said that the United States had a moral obligation to the rest of the world to use its power to make sure there was world peace. On the other side, interventionists, like Wilson, said that the United States had a moral obligation to the rest of the world to use its power to make sure there was world peace. Without the United States at the table, they said, the hard-won peace would fall apart as hundreds of little problems hold the world back into war. Some Republicans, known as irreconcilables, said they would not vote for the treaty no matter what, but others, called reservationists, would vote yes for the treaty if there were changes to get rid of Article 10. Wilson decided that to convince the senators to say yes, he would have to get the American people to support him. So he left for a cross-country trip to give speeches about the treaty. But after the stress of 6 months in Paris, the speaking tour was too much for him. Wilson had a stroke and could hardly walk or talk. His wife, Edith Wilson, took care of him. Many historians think that decisions President Wilson officially made at this time were probably really made by Edith. Angry that his dream of a new world order was slipping away, that he could no longer get around, Wilson wrote a letter to Democrats in the Senate telling them not to agree to any changes the Republicans wanted. With no one willing to give up anything, Congress voted against the Treaty of Versailles and did not join the League of Nations. The United States had to make its own separate peace treaty with Germany and never joined the League of Nations. As Wilson had feared, without the United States, the League of Nations was not strong enough to stop countries from starting wars. Although Wilson won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 for his efforts to create world peace, he was embarrassed and angry that his country would not participate. He died just a couple years later in 1924. Americans were saying no to internationalism in more ways than just staying out of Wilson's League of Nations. People wanted to close off the country from what many people thought were dangerous outside ideas. For many years, the United States had taken in waves of new immigrants who would help build the cities, bridges, and factories that had made America a great power. The children of these new immigrants had fought for their new country in World War I. But now, Europe looked like a dangerous place. Radical ideas, and many thought immigrants from Europe would bring those dangerous ideas with them. One such idea was anarchism. Anarchists think that all governments are bad. This is not a new idea in America. In fact, President William McKinley had been killed by an anarchist in 1901. But by 1918, a new and even more dangerous idea had come up during the war, which scared Americans. Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, had led a communist revolution in Russia, which made communists and socialists in America hopeful that a similar revolution could happen in the United States. The old industrial workers of the world, IWW, or Wobblies, of the late 1800s, who had always been a very small group, suddenly seemed bigger and more dangerous. Taken together, the rise of communists in Russia and the changes the war caused in Europe led many Americans to think it was time to stop immigration and get rid of dangerous ideas at home. There are 3 events that show how much Americans were afraid of these outside ideas. First was the trial of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti in 1921. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants who were put on trial for robbery and murder. There was no proof that they had done it, but both men were anarchists who wanted to overthrow the American government and were immigrants as well. At their trial, the prosecutor talked about Sacco and Vanzetti's radical ideas, and the jury found them guilty. Even after more evidence was found to show that they had not committed the crimes, both men were executed. The trial was clearly unfair, but people got what they wanted: protection from outsiders and foreign ideas. The second event that shows the isolationist feeling that was common after World War I are the raids led by President Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. He wanted to make sure there would never be a communist revolution in the United States. Palmer helped start the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, and in 1919-1920, Palmer and FBI officers searched the homes of people he thought might be dangerous to America. In total, about 5,000 people were put in jail, even without being able to talk to a lawyer. For Palmer, Basic civil rights were less important than finding people who might hurt the country, especially communists. Historians call this time at the end of World War I the First Red Scare, using the color that is a symbol of communism. It was a time when Americans were willing to give up basic rights to protect themselves from dangers they thought were real. Finally, the waves of immigration that are so famous from the Gilded Age came to an end. In 1921, Congress passed a law to limit the number of people that could come from any country. The Immigration Act of 1924 lowered the limit even more, making it harder to move to the United States. When President Coolidge signed the law, he said, "America must be kept American." However, what it meant to be American seems to be based a lot on where a person was from, at least in the eyes of the people who wrote the laws. The quotas were so low that almost no one could come to America except people from Great Britain and Germany, where the country's first, mostly white, mostly Protestant Christian immigrants had come from. Almost no one from Southern and Eastern Europe was allowed in, and immigration from China and Japan was totally stopped. Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe lost a safe place to get away to, just as Hitler and his anti-Semitic Nazi party were about to rise to power. That concludes this lesson in our study of the First World War. We'll close out by recapping our big ideas. The United States entered the fighting in the last year of World War I. Americans made up a tiny fraction of all the men on the battlefields of Europe. The end of the war came on November 11th, 1918. European powers had lost millions of men in battle, as well as civilians, and a flu pandemic swept the world in 1918, killing millions more. President Woodrow Wilson went to Europe after the war had finished to negotiate a peace deal. He described his vision for a peaceful world in a speech entitled The 14 Points. The most important of these was the creation of a League of Nations, in which future conflicts could be resolved without war. The result of the negotiations was the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson succeeded in getting the Europeans to create a League of Nations, although they also imposed a harsh punishment on Germany. Wilson's efforts to join the League of Nations faced a major challenge. The Constitution gives the Senate the authority to ratify all treaties, and one element of the League of Nations was a commitment by every nation to defend any other nation under attack. Wilson thought this would stop countries from going to war. In reality, Republicans in the Senate feared that this would mean the United States would be forced to join wars that they were really not its business, and voted against the treaty. Without the United States, the League of Nations was seriously weakened. By rejecting the Treaty of Versailles and membership in the League of Nations, the United States also rejected Wilson's dream of internationalism. Instead, for the next 20 years, the nation pursued a policy of isolationism. Fear of foreigners and dangerous foreign ideas swept the nation. Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, cutting off almost all immigration from Europe and ending immigration entirely from Asia. It was a Red Scare as police arrested communists. Immigrant anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted in a deeply flawed trial that many saw as evidence of the nation's eagerness to root out dangerous ideas. Thank you very much for sticking with me all the way to the end. Make sure you use your study guide and the Quizlet sets to review. When I see you next time, we'll be learning about one of the most exciting decades in history, the Roaring '20s. I'll see you then.
Send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over.